I came home early that Wednesday because a work meeting was canceled at the last minute, and at the time it felt completely meaningless. Just one of those small disruptions to a routine I've followed for years without thinking. I remember sitting in my car for a moment before going inside, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, staring at the front of the house like it was any other day. I unlocked the front door quietly, more out of habit than intention, set my bag down by the wall, and noticed Lauren's car in the driveway even though she wasn't supposed to be home yet. That alone felt slightly off, but I brushed it aside. I didn't call out her name or announce myself. I moved through the hallway slowly, the familiar creak of the floorboards sounding louder than usual, expecting nothing more than silence and maybe a few minutes to clear my head before heading back out. That's when I heard her voice coming from the kitchen. It was calm, relaxed, familiar, the exact tone she always used when she talked to her mother, warm and confident in ways she rarely sounded with me anymore. She was on the phone on speaker, and when my name came up, so casually it stopped me in place without me even realizing I'd stopped walking. Lauren said she was finally ready to divorce me, and she said it without hesitation, without emotion, like she was confirming a decision that had already been settled and filed away. She explained that being married to me was financially embarrassing, that my nonprofit salary made her uncomfortable, that she hated having to explain to people what I did for a living. She talked in detail about dinners with friends, about standing around tables with expensive wine, about conversations that always turned awkward when someone asked what I did and how much I made. She talked about future vacations she wanted, places she wanted to see, and how my income made her feel like she was constantly settling for less than she deserved. She laughed softly and said she was tired of pretending my work mattered when it didn't bring in real money, tired of defending a man who chose purpose over profit. She joked that men like me never fight back, that I was predictable, safe to leave, the kind who would quietly accept whatever decision was placed in front of him, because I always had. I stood there in the hallway, unseen, listening to my wife talk about me like I wasn't even a person anymore, just a problem she tolerated until she no longer needed to. Her mother murmured approval through the phone, reinforcing every word, and Lauren agreed, saying she deserved better, someone who wouldn't limit her lifestyle or make her feel smaller by association. What hurt the most wasn't cruelty. It was how practical she sounded, how clean and organized her reasoning was. There was no anger in her voice, no resentment, just certainty and relief. In that moment, I understood she didn't see me as her partner anymore, only as a liability she was finally ready to discard. I felt something hollow open in my chest as years of shared memories shifted and rewrote themselves in my mind. Every compromise, every late night, every quiet sacrifice replayed with a different meaning. I remember defending my career choice, explaining why the work mattered to me, believing that purpose and contribution counted for something in a marriage. I remember nodding along during arguments, backing down to keep the peace, telling myself that patience was strength. Standing there, invisible in my own home, I felt smaller than I ever had, not angry, not shocked, just quietly erased a house felt unfamiliar, like it already belonged to someone else, like I was already a guest in a life she was prepared to leave behind when she ended the call and said she'd tell me soon, that she just needed to choose the right moment. I stepped back slowly, walked out the door without making a sound, and sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, breathing through the weight of it, knowing my marriage had already ended in that kitchen, without my voice ever being part of the conversation. That evening I behaved exactly the way I always did, because I didn't want to give her anything new to react to or question. I went into the kitchen, washed my hands slowly, and started cooking dinner as if the day had unfolded normally, moving through familiar motions I had repeated for years without thinking. I took my time chopping vegetables, aligning them neatly on the cutting board, listening to the steady rhythm of the knife against the wood, letting the routine anchor me. I waited for the pan to heat, added oil at the right moment, adjusted the flame, stirred carefully, tasting and correcting seasoning with the same quiet attention I always gave my meals. I set the table, straightened the placemats, poured water into 2 identical glasses, and plated the food with care, making sure nothing looked rushed or careless. When Lauren walked into the kitchen, she paused for a moment, visibly reassured by the sight of normalcy, and I could tell she took it as confirmation that I was exactly who she thought I was. We sat down and ate together, exchanging small talk about work, schedules, and nothing that mattered, and I kept my voice even, my posture relaxed, my expressions neutral. I wasn't numb and I wasn't distracted. I was deliberate, fully present in my restraint. I listened to the clink of forks against plates, the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet sounds of the house settling into evening. After dinner, I washed the dishes, wiped the counters, dried my hands, and waited When the house finally fell into that particular stillness that comes at night, she said it. She told me she wanted a divorce, carefully and rehearsed, like she expected pushback. I looked at her and agreed immediately. No pause, no argument, no questions. I didn't ask why, didn't try to explain myself, didn't defend my choices or my work or my life. I simply said, okay. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her shoulders dropped, her breathing eased, and relief flooded her face so quickly she didn't even try to hide it. She looked shocked for a split second, then visibly lighter, interpreting my calm as weakness and my agreement as surrender. She began talking more, filling the space, explaining why this made sense, why it was for the best, why we had grown apart. I let her talk. I made a conscious decision not to correct her assumptions, not to challenge her version of me, not to reveal anything about my background, my finances, or the reasons behind the choices I'd made. I understood that explaining myself would only give her something to push against, something to dismiss or minimize. Silence gave her nothing to argue with. Patience gave me control. I nodded when it was appropriate, answered briefly when necessary, and stayed quiet when words would have only served her narrative. She mistook my composure for resignation, my restraint for defeat, and I allowed her to. I didn't feel the need to convince her of anything anymore. The version of me she believed she understood no longer needed my participation. When the conversation ended, she looked relieved, almost satisfied, like she had finally resolved the problem she'd been carrying. I went to bed that night calm and clear, knowing that by choosing silence over confrontation, I hadn't lost anything, and that patience had preserved something far more important than her understanding. The divorce was structured from the very beginning to be something Lauren could walk away from feeling victorious, and I let it unfold that way without resistance. She hired an attorney almost immediately, a man who looked exactly like you'd expect, expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, confident posture, and an expression that suggested he was used to winning before the conversation even started. He spoke quickly, used polished language, and made a point of projecting control, not just to me, but to Lauren as well, as if reassuring her that she was in capable hands. From a first meeting, it was obvious they both saw me the same way, calm, quiet, uncomplicated, a man who wouldn't be a problem. When we began the process of asset disclosure, I reported exactly what Lauren expected to hear. My nonprofit salary stated plainly, my modest retirement account listed without commentary, and no mention of anything that could disrupt the image she already had of me. I watched her posture soften as the numbers were read out loud, watched the attorney nod slightly, already filing me away as insignificant. When the question of side income came up, I mentioned my consulting work casually, deliberately minimizing it, describing it as irregular, minor, and not worth focusing on. I kept my tone neutral, almost dismissive, and it worked exactly as intended. The attorney glanced down at his notes, made a brief mark, and immediately waved it off as irrelevant, clearly uninterested in digging deeper. Lauren didn't ask a single follow-up question. She had already decided the outcome, and this only confirmed it for her. The rest of the process moved quickly after that. She took the house without hesitation, claimed the majority of our savings, and secured a portion of my retirement, and I didn't contest any of it. I signed every document I was handed, listened quietly during every explanation, and maintained the same steady demeanor throughout. Every assumption they made about me worked in my favor, and I had no reason to challenge them. Lauren walked out of those meetings visibly satisfied, convinced she had escaped cleanly and decisively from a man she viewed as unambitious and financially unremarkable. Later, I heard through mutual acquaintances how she bragged about it, how easily it had all gone, how simple it was to leave someone who never fought back, how relieved she felt to start over without dragging excess weight behind her. She framed it as a personal triumph, proof of her intelligence and foresight, and I let that version of the story stand. She believed she had won, because everything she could see went to her, and because I allowed her that belief, the divorce ended exactly the way she wanted it to, smooth, uncontested, and entirely on her terms. Lauren never cared to ask about my family beyond what fit neatly into her assumptions, and I never corrected her, because to her anything that didn't shine loudly didn't exist. She knew my parents lived modestly, that I drove an unremarkable car, that I worked in the nonprofit world, and she assumed that meant there was nothing behind it, no history, no foundation, no depth worth investigating. What she never knew and never bothered to know was that my family had built its wealth quietly, long before I was born, through real estate acquisitions made decades earlier, back when patience and consistency mattered more than visibility. My grandfather was the kind of man who never spoke about money in public, who wore the same coat for years and fixed things himself, but who understood structure, timing, and protection better than anyone I have ever known. He placed everything into a legally protected trust designed with strict conditions, clauses written carefully to ensure that no marriage, no spouse, and no outside influence could ever lay claim to what he built. It wasn't about distrust, it was about intention. He believed wealth should move forward intact, not be fractured by circumstance or emotion. Years before I ever met Lauren, before our relationship even existed, I fulfilled one of the requirements of that trust without fully understanding how important it would eventually become. I legally restored my family middle name, a name that had been carried through generations, a name tied directly to the trust and its provisions. When I told Lauren about it at the time, she laughed, mocked it openly, and dismissed it as meaningless, saying it sounded pretentious and outdated, something only insecure people cared about. I didn't argue with her, and I didn't explain why it mattered. To her, names were aesthetic, not legal, not historical, not binding. What she never realized was that that single act, restoring that name, was not symbolic. It was contractual. It was one of the final conditions required to establish my legal standing within the trust. The remaining requirement was separation finalized without dispute, without financial entanglement, without claims made against assets that were never visible in the first place. The divorce, structured entirely around what she believed I was worth, completed that requirement quietly and cleanly. While she walked away believing she had taken everything of value, the trust recognized the separation as closure, not loss. Every document filed, every signature placed, every uncontested agreement brought the process closer to completion. There was no dramatic moment, no announcement, no sudden change in my life that would have drawn attention. The trust didn't activate with celebration. It activated with confirmation. Lauren never asked about my family legacy, never questioned why I was comfortable letting things go, never wondered why I didn't fight for what appeared to be mine. She believed indifference meant emptiness, and silence meant lack in reality. The separation finalized every condition my grandfather had put in place decades earlier, and everything she dismissed as irrelevant turned out to be precisely what mattered. 1 full month passed after the separation became official, long enough for the paperwork to feel final, and for everyone involved to believe the story had already ended. And that was exactly when everything shifted. There was no announcement, no build-up, no dramatic moment that anyone could point to later. I wasn't sitting in an office or waiting for a call. I was living quietly, keeping the same routines, waking up early, making coffee the same way I always had, going through my days without any outward change. While my life looked unchanged on the surface, a formal legal notice was being delivered to Lauren's attorney through the proper channels. It wasn't casual, and it wasn't softened by personal language. It was a carefully structured document, written with deliberate precision, every sentence measured, every term chosen to leave no space for interpretation. The letter stated clearly that I was now the sole legal owner of a privately held real estate portfolio valued at over $18 million. It detailed how the properties had been acquired decades earlier, long before my marriage ever existed, and how they had always been held outside of any marital framework. Each property was identified, each acquisition date listed, each legal structure explained methodically. The notice emphasized that these holdings had never been marital assets, never shared, never exposed, and that ownership had transferred only after the separation was fully finalized, in strict compliance with the trust conditions and existing law. It explained how the trust operated, how control shifted only when every requirement was satisfied, and how those requirements had now been completed without dispute or challenge. The letter went further, clarifying that the consulting income Lauren's attorney had dismissed during disclosure was directly tied to the management and oversight of that portfolio. What had been framed as minor side work was in fact structured advisory compensation connected to property operations, tenant oversight, financing coordination, and long-term asset strategy. The same income they had barely acknowledged was now contextualized as a functional layer of something substantial, intentional, and protected. The notice stated plainly that Lauren had no legal claim whatsoever, no stand in the contest, no avenue for appeal, no leverage to apply. Everything had been executed years in advance, patiently and without urgency, designed to activate only under very specific circumstances that had now been met. I later learned how the letter was received, how the attorney read it once, then again, slower the second time, how the confidence he had carried through the divorce drained as the implications settled in. Lauren had believed the process was over, that she had taken everything of value, that she had escaped easily from a man she saw as financially insignificant. The letter quietly dismantled that belief without confrontation or explanation. There was no follow-up from me, no message, no clarification offered. The notice existed to establish fact, not reaction. It closed the matter permanently and cleanly. The assets were mine legally, structurally, and irrevocably, not because of clever maneuvering the divorce, but because they had never belonged to the marriage in the first place. The transfer didn't feel like a reveal or victory. It felt like completion, the final step in a process set in motion decades earlier by someone who understood patience, silence, and structure far better than emotion. Everything that had been dismissed, minimized, or mocked now existed on paper, undeniable and final. And the letter redefined everything Lauren believed she had walked away from without a single word ever needing to be spoken between us. Lauren's realization did not arrive slowly or with room to prepare. It struck her all at once, in public, surrounded by people she had carefully chosen to witness her confidence. I wasn't there, but the way it happened was later described to me in enough detail that I could picture it clearly. She was sitting with friends at a restaurant she liked to be seen in, dressed well, relaxed, laughing easily, still enjoying the afterglow of what she believed was a clean and effortless victory. She had been talking freely, telling her version of the story, framing the divorce as a smart escape from a man who lacked ambition, joking about how uncomplicated all was. Her phone rang in the middle of that moment, and at first she barely reacted, mildly annoyed by the interruption, until she glanced at the screen and saw her attorney's name. She answered casually, expecting something routine, maybe paperwork or a follow-up detail. Instead, his voice came through strained and urgent, stripped of the smooth confidence she relied on throughout the divorce. As he spoke, her expression shifted sharply, the smile fading as confusion took its place. Then something heavier. Words started landing in fragments that didn't make sense yet. Ownership, transfer, trust activation, protected assets, no legal claim. She tried to interrupt him, tried to slow the conversation down, but he kept talking, pushing through the explanation as if he knew delaying it would only make it worse. Around her, her friends kept laughing and talking, unaware at first that anything had changed, while Lauren sat frozen, staring at the table, gripping her phone as the details began to connect. As the reality settled in, every insult she had ever made about me replayed in her mind without mercy. She remembered mocking my contentment, the way I was comfortable with less noise and fewer possessions, the way she laughed at my old car and called it embarrassing. She remembered telling people I was wasting my potential, that I lacked drive, that my quiet routines and simple habits proved I would never be more than I was. She remembered the certainty with which she dismissed my patience as passivity and my restraint as weakness. Each memory hit differently now, stripped of the story she had built around it. As the call ended, her phone began lighting up with notifications, messages, links being shared, headlines starting to circulate. Articles talk about a low-profile real estate portfolio changing hands, about generational holdings quietly transferring ownership, and my name appeared there, understated and factual, without drama or commentary. No explanation was offered, no context provided, just confirmation. She scrolled through them with unsteady hands, reading and rereading the same lines, watching her version of reality collapse in real time. The friends around her started noticing the shift, their voices lowering, questions forming, but she couldn't answer them. Everything she had believed, everything she had told herself and others, unraveled at once. The man she thought she had outgrown hadn't been small. He had been private. The life she mocked as empty hadn't been lacking. It had been deliberate. Her confidence drained away as the weight of it settled, not as regret, but as realization, the understanding that she had never truly known the ground she was standing on, the narrative she built, where she was a winner and I was a liability, collapsed instantly and publicly, and there was no way to put it back together before everyone around her saw the truth she had never cared to ask about. Lauren showed up at my apartment without warning late that afternoon, her presence announced by a hard, impatient knock that echoed down the narrow hallway. I recognized it instantly, the same knock she used when she was already angry and had no intention of being calm. When I opened the door, she stepped inside before I could even say a word, moving past me like she still had the right. Her eyes immediately swept over the apartment, taking in the small living room, the plain furniture, the lack of anything impressive, and I could see confusion mixed with frustration when the space didn't match whatever image she had built in her head. The place was clean, quiet, modest, the kind of space she used to criticize without hesitation, and standing there she looked almost offended by how ordinary it was. She turned on me quickly, her voice raised, words spilling out in sharp bursts as she accused me of deception and betrayal, saying I had hidden my true life from her, that I had manipulated her. Everything about me had been a lie. I didn't interrupt her. I stood there calmly, leaning against the counter, listening as she unloaded weeks of pent-up anger and panic into the room. The accusations kept coming, each one louder than the last, but underneath them I could hear something else. desperation creeping into her voice as her certainty began to crack. She demanded to know how long I had been planning it, how long I had been pretending to be small, how long I had been laughing at her behind her back. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I answered slowly and evenly, telling her I had never lied to her, not once. I explained that I lived exactly the life she saw, because it was the life I chose, that my job, my car, my routines, and my quiet contentment were real and honest, not an act. I told her she never asked questions that went deeper than appearances, never listened when I spoke about values instead of outcomes, never tried to understand anything that didn't align with the image she wanted to project. As I spoke, her anger faltered, draining away as something more vulnerable surfaced. Her shoulders slumped, her voice softened, and that's when she admitted it. She said she would have stayed if she had known about the money, that things would have been different, that she could have made it work if she had understood what I was really worth. Hearing it said so plainly settled everything inside me. I told her without hesitation that if wealth was the only thing keeping her with me, then the marriage had already been over long before the divorce ever happened. I told her that love tied to numbers isn't love. It's convenience dressed up as commitment. She tried to step closer, her tone shifting to pleading now, talking about mistakes, about pressure, about fear of settling for the wrong life. But I didn't move. I walked to the door, opened it, and held it there in silence, making my choice unmistakably clear. She stood frozen for a moment, searching my face for hesitation, for softness, for something to grab onto, but there was nothing left to offer. Finally, she turned and walked out into the hallway. Her footsteps echoing as she left, I closed the door behind her gently, not out of anger, but certainty, knowing that was the last time she would ever walk out of my life. This was never about revenge for me, not in the dramatic sense people like to project onto situations like this, not about watching someone else fall or savoring the moment they realize they misjudged you. When everything was finalized and the legal noise faded into background, I went back to my life exactly as I had lived it before, because that life had always been mine by choice. I continued working my modest job, waking up early on weekdays, going to the same quiet morning routines, making coffee at home, reading the same news summaries, and leaving the apartment without any sense that I needed to prove something to the world. I still sat at the same desk, did the same work, and felt the same sense of purpose I always had, because the work mattered to me in ways money never replaced. The wealth didn't change my schedule or my priorities, and I never wanted it to. I lived simply because simplicity gave me space to think clearly, to breathe, to exist without performance. I invested quietly, the way my family always had, with patience and long-term thinking, never chasing attention, never needing acknowledgement. I donated to causes I believed in, the same ones I had supported long before the divorce, organizations that worked slowly and consistently rather than loudly, and I made those contributions without attaching my name or expecting gratitude. I avoided attention deliberately, declined invitations that would have turned my life into a spectacle, and stayed out of circles that thrived on comparison and display. The life I chose afterward wasn't shaped in response to Lauren at all. It was a continuation of who I had always been when no one was watching. Meanwhile, her reality shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated, without me there to quietly absorb pressure, without someone willing to live smaller, so she could live larger. Maintaining the lifestyle she demanded became increasingly difficult. Appearances are expensive, and they demand constant upkeep, constant validation, constant momentum. I heard fragments through distance, through people we once both knew, about how things weren't as effortless as she expected, about strain, about adjustments she didn't want to make. I never followed up on those details, never asked questions, never checked in. I didn't feel satisfaction or struggle, and I didn't feel the need to watch it unfold. I didn't celebrate her regret or wait for an apology that would have meant nothing by the time it arrived. I didn't seek validation, recognition, or understanding from her or from anyone else. None of that would have added value to my life. What I gained wasn't humiliation or exposure, and it wasn't some dramatic reversal that needed witnesses. What I gained was peace, the kind that settles in quietly when you no longer have to explain yourself. It was clarity, the absence of doubt about who I was and why I lived the way I did. It was a freedom to make decisions without fear of being judged for them. My victory wasn't loud, visible, or satisfying the way stories like this are usually told. It existed in ordinary days, in steady choices. In a life built deliberately on my own terms, I didn't win. Because she lost, I won because I stayed true to myself, and because I finally lived without shrinking for someone who never wanted to understand me in the first place.